So now we will move on to some concluding remarks by Boaz and Arnon. I forgot who's supposed to start. I guess Boaz, because he unmuted himself. So go ahead.
Was I first? I don't know who won. Okay, I'll
Who
start.
won?
Okay, I'll start.
Boaz, you did.
Okay. Okay. In any case, Arnon will say smarter things. So let me start. And we'll end with a bang. Okay. So I'll start by saying that first, thank you all for attending. I learned a lot during this workshop, and I'd like by highlighting there were talks that talked some talks like the last one talked about the tension between center and periphery, and I think this is a good place to start because this workshop is a collaboration between two institutions. The first is the University of Haifa, which is one of the seven universities in Israel, if you count Ariel, and Zefat Academic College, which is a public college located at the in the periphery of Israel in the north. And most of my students are residents of the north of Israel, which is the economic and geographical periphery of Israel. I think that more than half of them are local residents, local Palestinian and Druze residents of the Galilee. And I'm also teaching in an information system department rather than a philosophy department. So although I'm like my PhD is in history and philosophy of science, and I'm a social epistemologist, I'm actually teaching in an information system department. So yesterday I got a text message, a WhatsApp message from one of my students. Oh, I should say that I've given my students an assignment. They have to, in one of the courses, they have to watch to attend this workshop for at least 2 lectures and answer a series of questions. I can see Elran here is laughing. Hi, Elran. So he's one of the students who survived this trial, and it's not an easy task for them because also their knowledge or comprehension of English is not as those of students that you find in the research universities. So one of the students, a very good student, I should say, sent me a WhatsApp message and said, Boaz, why do they have to take this crap? Why teach us, PHP, JavaScript, Node.js, Angular, React, but why do we need all of this philosophy? How will it help us in our life? It's all interesting and so on, but why should we study it? And that's a fair question, because the students that I teach are not the kind of students that you typically find in philosophy that dream about a career in academia or in the public sector or in the creative industries in some PR or consulting capacity. But there are students who want to integrate in the high-tech industry, and they are all already coming from a lower place because they are peripheral. They come from a peripheral higher institution, from public college. So why do they need all of this philosophy? And I hope that my answer to them is that it's not enough to know the technology. In order to design better products, both products that work better or that make good use of ideas such as crowdsourcing, or to make the right choices in the design of interface, you need to know some other things other than just the mere tools that you're using. And I hope that at least some of you, I'm talking to my students, are persuaded, have been persuaded that you can go to achieve a lot of mileage, a lot of kilometrage from just theorizing or just thinking about a problem and conceptualizing, for example, T's talk about how you create a gamification environment. If I was one of those evil companies that wanted to design an evil gaming system that would just keep people, give people the illusion of understanding, I would hire T. And I will give him a job, and because he has good ideas, you can make much more money working for the bad guys than the good guys. But also, if you want, if you listen to Isaac talk, which is I participated in, you can see that you can get a lot of insight just from conceptualizing about the relations between platforms and possibilities or affordances and users and so on, and really make design better tools. So this is my answer. I hope that some of you at least were satisfied, were somehow convinced. Now, particular insights, or I think lessons. I think from all of the talks that we've seen, we can safely say that it's unproductive when we talk about dealing with epistemically toxic content of all kinds, including the one that Keren talked about. It's unproductive to focus on the individual. Although we have in philosophy a tradition of S knows that P and so on, just focus narrowly on what an individual knows, it's unproductive if we want to address those issues. What we need to focus, or the correct focus should be on the individual in her environment. And what we want to ask is how to situate the individual in the environment in a way that the environment will produce good habits or good norms, or what Axel called routines. There should be something that systematizes individuals' behavior and direct them in the good, in the productive ways to deal with all kinds of toxic content that they encounter, and know what to do with it. Also, I think with respect to Sarit presentation, who also presented a game that works. It makes people more aware of verifying sources. But as she said, in order to make that game work, you have to make people play it somehow and internalize kind of what they've learned and implement those behaviors in other settings. So just narrowly educating people or focusing on people is not good enough. We need to see how people, platforms, and individuals, people, platforms, and what was the third, and possibilities, I think, interact with each other. And I think this is one of the main lessons, because I think this crowd is not naive about thinking that education or fact-checking or content moderation can do the work. Adding to that all of the problems of content moderation that Keren talked about. So I think that if you want to make people more hygienic, you need to design a more hygienic environment that makes people, as Axel said, behave in a more hygienic way, and shape the environment to produce correct norms and habits and correct behaviors among people. And if we manage to do that, or at least slightly advance toward that goal, I think we've done something. I want also just to conclude by saying that philosophy indeed has a practical import. I think I can brag. Arnon, Aviv, and I have recently signed an R&D collaboration agreement with an internet company that manages online platforms, and some of the major sites that you use their platforms. And they came at the dead end because they saw that there is a lot of toxic, they call it toxic discourse on their platforms, and they don't know what to do with it. And they turned to us, philosophers, both to tell them what toxicity is, and also how to develop tools to address it. And the fact that we managed to sign such a contract says also to my students, you see, philosophy can actually help people and companies do the right things. This is at least my, I think, optimistic or slightly optimistic way to conclude this workshop.
Okay, so thank you, Boaz, for these remarks. And Arnon, we now move over to you. You need to unmute yourself.
So
Yes.
first, I'm very glad that, Boaz, you won the lottery, not because what I'm going to say is smarter, but because it's going to nicely dovetail on what you said, on some of what you said, though I'm afraid that I will end up, I think, with a more pessimistic tone. So first, I come from a department of philosophy, not so, and the challenge for me as someone who interacts with philosophers is explaining, okay, philosophy is very important, but you organize this workshop where you have people dirtying their hands with empirical work and from cognitive science and education. So one of the thing I think we should all be very thankful for is that I think I don't know if we should pride ourselves with the success. I think the speakers should take pride in this. I think every philosopher who was here, I think it should be obvious to him or her that there's very interesting interactions that can be done between empirical work in social sciences and philosophy. And many of the philosophy talks here were rich in virtue of this, of their sensitivity to empirical work. And so I think that this worked out, I think, very nicely. And in general, I really want to thank you all for excellent talks. I learned a lot, and there's a lot that I'll be thinking about in the next days and months and years that I take out of this workshop. So thanks to all of you. And it's, of course, impossible to summarize what we heard here. Having such a rich array of different types of talks. And I thought what could be useful for further discussion is to try to identify two themes that I think reemerged in different forms throughout several of the talks. I think one theme that dominated the first day of the workshop, and another theme that perhaps was more salient today, and to just raise questions about the connection between the two themes. And what's nice about this is that Boaz talked about our need to think about the relations between the individual and her environment. These two themes, I think, nicely fit in with this kind of framework that Boaz suggested. So I think in the first day, one of the central themes we heard about was that of what started with in Axel's talk about epistemic routines. And later we encountered other forms of what I would call either epistemic routines or non-deliberative forms of cognition. So, and what Axel's initial point was, and this was, I think, a theme that we encountered again in other talks, is that especially in our postmodern online environment of saturated with amounts of information that humans in previous ages never needed to encounter. Epistemic routines or non-deliberative forms of cognition play an exceedingly important role. I think that T noted rightly that terminating deliberation is something that we always needed to do. But I think that our reliance on non-deliberative forms of cognition is perhaps getting more and more important in our new informational environment. So that's one theme. The other theme I think, was the focus of many of the talks today, was what I like to call the new normative void created by new forms of technologies. The fact that was highlighted in Isaac's talk and in other, including Aviv's, of new technologies creating new contexts and new communicative kinds of acts, which are not governed by stable and clear norms, unlike some of the more familiar communicative acts, such as ascertaining or conjecturing, etc. So just to remind you of some of the talks in which how these two themes came up. So I mentioned Axel's talk, but I think his main point was that we are suffering from a mismatch between the kind of epistemic environment in which we are currently functioning and previously acquired epistemic routines. So the big question I think that Axel left us with is whether we can acquire new kinds of routines that are more fitting to our new environment. Sarit, for instance, in her talk, described educational approaches that and ask how these educational approaches can address the challenge and created. And I think that part of what she suggested and some of her examples suggested is that we have ways of teaching new routines, teaching learners how to use new routine and what the value of new routine may be, and how they can avoid, by using them, avoid spreading fake news. And of course, I mentioned that the same subject reappeared also in Glenn's talk. The notion of passive testimony, I think, is very much a notion related to non-deliberative form of cognition. And the danger of the illusion of clarity, which T warned us against, is a danger of terminating deliberation for the wrong kind of reasons. In the talks we heard today, I suppose that the memory is fresher with respect to the talks that we heard today, so I won't remind you of them. Highlighted, as I mentioned earlier, the problem with the unclarity of norms, and this is something I'm not sure about, and I'll be glad to hear from Isaac and Boaz a bit more, whether it's that there are norms, but they are not clear, or as the metaphor of the normative void might suggest, there's just no norm of, so there is a norm of assertion. We might not be clear exactly sometimes what it is, but is there a norm of liking or sharing? It's not exactly clear to me. But what I think the discussion today suggested that, and also I think in Sasha Altai's talk yesterday, part of the cost of the reason I think that, as he suggested, sharing falsehood may be more costly than, or the cost of sharing falsehood is greater than the benefit of sharing truth. I think this is not merely a psychological observation. This seems to me to be an observation about the accepted norms. And all this suggests that part of the solution to the crisis within we find ourselves right now might be normative, as Aviv suggested. But here we have, I think, and one of the take-home lessons that I go out from this workshop is that we have to focus on the one hand on norms, on the other hand on what I can broadly call routines. But I think what's the combination of these two things should lead us to think is we should think about the relations between norms and routines. So there are different kinds of norms, different kind of evidential norms. Sometimes norms support deliberation or require deliberation. But given the theme of the first day of our workshop, I think we should think in particular about how norms and stable norms can support stable routines and effective, efficient routines. And that I think is a much greater challenge. Also for some reasons that were raised, for instance, by Axel in some of his questions to some of the speakers. The speed in which technology creates new forms of normative voids raises the question whether stable norms which support stable routines can be developed quickly enough. We can, I think, as Aviv possibly suggested, we can support, for instance, more responsible epistemic behavior through an advertising campaign. The question is, can we support in this way norms that would create stable routines that do not require deliberation, which are automatic, which are, I think, so important in general and specifically in this kind of environment in which we find ourselves right now. So I'll end here. I hope that some of you might want to address some of these issues during the discussion that we will now open. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnon. So what we're going to do now is we're going to let first the presenters, if they want, give any concluding remarks of their own, something similar. We did not ask you to prepare anything, so only if you think you have anything you want to share with us for a few minutes. I see most of you are still here, and then open up the floor to anyone else who wants to comment, not only on specific talks or questions, but about the entire workshop. So I see, okay, so let's start with Ori, who we haven't heard a lot from today. Ori,
thank you. Just something quick, that one of the themes here is stabilizing norms, or some kind of indication that a comment or something that is being said is not supposed to be there. So it is a theme, and my worry that I would like to put the spotlight on here is that in some cases, marginalized groups sometimes act against the accepted norms, and they do so in order to achieve positive social purposes, such as drawing attention to issues or drawing attention to things that were suppressed. So maybe stabilizing norms is part of the solution, but obviously not the whole solution, and just that.
Okay, thank you very much, Oli. I'm just going to go by order of hand raises. I think that's how it's ordered. So T, I think I need to help you unmute again, right? Yes, got it. Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this great conference. When I was listening to a lot of the talks, I kept being reminded of this book and passage I've been obsessed with that stabbed me through the heart. And I was worried that it might also stab some of the rest of you through the heart. And the book, I think some of you know it, is Benkler, Ferris, and Roberts' Network Propaganda, which is out from OUP. And it really challenged, I mean, I write a lot about stuff from the perspective of like technological and large scale social changes. And I've been really drawn to, as I think a lot of you are, Cass Sunstein type views about polarization and about shifting technologies. And Bankler and this book have this basic challenge for us that I take really seriously. And that challenge is, if you look at the data on the US election, the spread of fake news is radically asymmetrical, right? It's way asymmetrical between the right and the rest. And they make a basic claim, which is, if you're a basically technological story, and a story like the ones we see where a new technology confuses the norms, we should expect, if that's the main causal factor, we should expect symmetry in the effect, but we don't see symmetry. So let me just read this. By the way, I got so obsessed with it that I wrote a pop piece pitting this against a polarization story. It actually just came out in Boston Review 40 minutes ago, so it's online now. But it has this quote that from Bankler that really did stab me from the heart. Here's what they say. As we've repeatedly seen, the prominent outlets on the left and center simply do not exhibit a parallel structure, content, or vehement outrage that we observe on the right. They're talking about just about US 2016 networks. These facts are as inconvenient to academics seeking a nonpartisan neutral diagnosis of what is happening to us as they are to professional journalists who are institutionally committed to describe the game in a nonpartisan way. Both communities have tended to focus on technology, we believe, because if technology is something that happens to all of us, no partisan finger pointing is required. But the facts we observe do not lend themselves to a natural both sides at fault analysis. So I want to suggest to a lot of the papers that I've seen that a lot of my own work and a lot of the work I've seen has to meet this challenge of explaining this deep asymmetry. And I've had to rethink a lot of what I think about what's going on faced with the asymmetrical data.
Okay, thank you. I have a thought about that maybe later, but first I'll let others speak. So Axel.
Yeah, great, thanks. I don't actually have a whole lot to add because I think Arnon gave a really great summary and managed to draw together some of the themes that were sort of in the air over the last couple of days. So I really, really enjoyed that workshop and want to take this opportunity to thank everyone involved for just so much food for thought for months to come. But I think one theme that I also realized again, because it's always good to be reminded of that, is really how much one can learn from truly interdisciplinary debate, where people who study the empirical phenomena closely and with attention to detail, coming out of various groups and subsystems within society, whether it's media, journalism, law, and the kind of philosophical approaches, which often tend to be a little bit detached from that, how they can inform each other. I think that was really a workshop where this, I think, really worked. And we saw this during the Q&A. And I'm really hopeful for this to be developing in this direction in the future. I mean, a few years ago, one still had to, I remember writing my first paper on rumors, actually published by Philosophia, the Israeli quarterly. But then that paper got rejected so many times by other journalists because, hey, you're quoting sociologists, that can't be proper philosophy. And luckily those days are over, and I hope they're over for good, so that one can draw on the rich literature, interesting literature everywhere. And I hope that this works in all possible directions and sort of permutations of combinations of approaches, because the topic is really so important that it can't be left to just one group that somehow posits that they have some privileged access to these kinds of debates. We're all in this, I think, together. That's usually a cliche, but I think here it's really true. So I think that's my take-home message, one of the take-home messages from me.
Thank you, Axel. Next, Sarit.
So I want to start by just saying thank you to Arnon and Boaz and Oli and Aviv for organizing this workshop. I really tremendously enjoyed it, and some of my students have participated and they also enjoyed it a lot. And I think that what made it really wonderful was the combination, the interdisciplinary connections that Axel just talked about between philosophy, psychology, and also education for a change. So it's really wonderful. And I just want to say that it's very hard to do educational work in this area without looking to psychology and philosophy. Now I have a seminar with MA students working on educational responses to post-truth problems, and I have teams working on these problems. So one of these teams, for example, is working on the problem of echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. So they read T's paper, and they're reading papers from psychologists, and they're reading papers from educators, and they have to take all of this into account as they try to develop educational solutions that will work in their communities. So I think that this kind of combination is really necessary to advance our thinking on these issues. And this brings me to my next point, which is the issue of norms and routines. So latching on to Arnon's comment. So the problem with education is that we're working on, these long-term changes. It's just changes so slow. If you're implementing change in curricula now, national curricula, learning materials, it's going to take years until it's implemented, years until teachers are trained, and new routines are established in education. So this makes it, the task and the responsibility and the difficulty of saying what should be the epistemic goals of education, it's a very difficult problem. And as you're talking about how these norms and routines shift, and the fact that the context is so dynamic and changing, this creates a very big problem as I see it from an educational perspective about, what should we be teaching now, thinking about, kids who are going to graduate, the long-term process of educational change, and what's going to happen with kids who are going to graduate like in 5 or 10 years from now. So that it's like, this is like one of the big things that I'm taking out of here. And I often have this kind of optimistic illusion that I'm going to open up some philosophy papers or psychological papers, and philosophers, this is what they're supposed to do. We're supposed to think about these questions and come up with answers, and usually I get back with a lot of debates. So it's very informative, but also still I think there's more work, things, Arnon and Boaz, and I think we should talk about these things more. And my last comment is just something that I feel like was kind of implicit in many of the talks, but maybe we did not make it explicit enough. And it kind of, Karen's talk brought it to me very strongly, is that there is epistemic injustice in all of this, because different groups are differentially affected by this. So there are people who are more at risk from the general, toxic information environment. So people who, for various reasons, like here in Israel, Ethiopian immigrant communities, they do not get their news from combination of mainstream media and social media. They mainly get their news from social media, and therefore their media diet is less balanced, and they're more susceptible to misinformation, which some of it, is coming from Ethiopia and all sorts of places. And there's also, gaps in digital literacy skills. So we're taking it for granted that people can read and people can understand source information, and all of these things can't be taken for granted because there's gaps in reading achievements, and which are strongly tied to digital literacy. And these are also, strongly impacted by socioeconomic gaps. So all this is maybe obvious, but still I felt like we should raise it, that we should be just aware that there's just huge epistemic injustice in all of this. People are not impacted by it similarly.
Oh, thank you, Sarit. And I'm really happy you explicitly said that, because you're right. I mean, I agree. Boaz, you.
Okay, yeah, I want to respond to T's point. First, I'm a bit skeptical about Ben Clare's research. I know that Dan Hicks, he posted some methodological critique of Ben Clare's work, and also, from our modest experience, albeit in a different environment, it's not true. There's toxic content or fake news on both sides of the political map. But suppose that, putting that aside, I think that the kind of criticism that you raise is not, you bark at the wrong, maybe you're barking at the wrong tree. I think that the kind of work that is really susceptible to your kind of criticism, which is correct, is the work by Caitlin O'Connor and James Weatherall and Kevin Zollman, who really see work in social epistemology in sort of like think of social epistemology as engineering networks of information, as plumbing, as large-scale plumbing of just regulating the information flow between nodes. And if you just do it correctly, you just adjust the nodes on the right, and you put people in the right networks in the right density and some other formal properties, everything will be fine. And this is entirely symmetrical and neutral, and this work doesn't matter if they are left wing or right wing or what network you're trying to engineer. It just works for any flow of information. And I'm really skeptical about those kinds of solutions. But our approach, Isaac, I think other people here, Aviv's, is normative, and normativity in the deep sense is value laden. So, like, we are not just neutrally, we're not arguing for neutrally implementing norms regardless of who the players are. Of course not. That won't work. No norms are values, and if, for example, the values need to be more liberal or more progressive, then that's the right solution. No, we are calling for making a stance. Even if you buy into Benkler's story, he diagnoses the problem as he says that the problem is that the mainstream conservative media doesn't follow the same norms as the right wing, as the liberal media, the major media, not the social media, the Fox News and so on. They keep repeating debunked stories and so on, where the other side allegedly doesn't do it. So you can hold them accountable and say you are not following certain norms, and you can apply and you can make accountable those who don't do certain things that are required. And in no way, I think, in our story, neutrality is a desirable goal. No, you should regulate those who don't conform to norms, and the norms have value, and they can be political value, and they can align themselves with some progressive aims and so on. So I think that our approach is, I'm not sure that the criticism is the right kind of criticism.
I will just add the one point, maybe to clarify my perspective, to give my perspective on what Boaz said, that our experience shows that it's not true, that it's only a problem on the right. I think that what we have seen is that it's extremely, the ability to really pinpoint what is toxic in specific posts extremely depends on your personal agenda. And I think most researchers are not, there isn't an even distribution of right and left among researchers. So maybe if there is among researchers in academia, among fact checkers, I think we'll most of us agree that most of those people are on the left. So their ability to identify, for example, falsities from the left it's much harder, even when you try and come it and see it as a neutral. And we had this within our team. We actually have different political perspectives and views from home. And we have seen how the same post that for one of us intuitively felt like, of course, it's true. And then the other ones pointed out something and so that's why, maybe that's one reason to doubt this claim. Yeah, I'll let you obviously answer, because we're addressing specifically what you said, that there is no like sort of objective way to come and find that it is indeed more a problem on the right or the left. And I'm saying that without having enough knowledge about the American systems. I'm talking about Israel and specifically. So let me just, I know that you want to respond to that, probably.
So by the way, I'm not saying that your arguments are wrong. I'm saying and I'm really drawn to these I mean, the stuff I publish on this is like, Twitter is like a game, right? It does this thing that's, I'm saying that we who want to tell that story need to explain certain asymmetries. And so I think we should get clear on the asymmetry. So my claim is that the right is always wrong and the left is always right. I think the thing that's interesting that you get from that Bankler pointed out is, first of all, their claim is just that there's an asymmetry in the 2016 American election. And I think what they want to claim is that asymmetry is itself asymmetrical across countries. So some countries, you see more fake news on the right. I'm certainly sure that there are some countries where you see more fake news on the left, and there are some countries where it's symmetrical. And my worry is the basic expectation, if you have a purely technological story, is you should see symmetrical symmetry. Every country that uses the technology should have the same effect across the political spectrum. So I'm not saying it's wrong, because I still am very drawn to technological stories. I'm saying we who are drawn to technological stories need to have a story to explain asymmetrical asymmetry across different, have these like weird structures that don't seem to match up just with use of social media. Like if this stuff just correlated strictly with the use of social media, then I wouldn't have this problem. But my worry is that it doesn't, and we need an explanation. I need an explanation.
Okay, I imagine we can continue for hours, but let's move on. Isaac has his hand raised for, it's probably hurting already.
Yeah, you're intending to shift the conversation, but instead I'm going to pull us right back into the mess. I think a really interesting case to think through this issue of symmetry is vaccine hesitancy. Maya Goldenberg has a great book that's just out that I think is called Vaccine Hesitancy. And in it, I haven't read it yet, but given what I've read of her work before, she reveals that, in fact, vaccine hesitancy is not, there's a sort of stereotype of who is going to be vaccine hesitant, and that's just not the reality. It turns out that, the more education you have, the more likely you are to be hesitant. The more, if you're the expectant mother, you're more likely to be vaccine hesitant, possibly because you're the one who is more likely to be making those decisions and that sort of thing. And so there's all these counterintuitive, to a certain intuition at least, counterintuitive demographic details in the case of vaccine hesitancy. And I suspect that you would find the same thing across a lot of issues. So maybe one small piece of what is going on here is just that it's easier to find and sort of ramp up a coherent story inside of either a dominant party or maybe a conservative party, because conservatism, there's a text that you're trying to conserve in a way, where if you're in the out of power group or the progressive group, there's just a lot more divergence. So you just maybe don't see as much of the same brand of conspiracy theory or the same brand of, you don't see a QAnon on the left right now. And maybe that's just because of how people are perceiving the like deep story of what's happening in politics in the country, that kind of thing. That's probably not a very satisfying answer. I agree that it's weird that there's an asymmetry whenever there's an asymmetry, but maybe again, as you look around, maybe it just turns out that there's no overall asymmetry. It's just that in particular places there's some. I'm not sure. Okay, and Arnon is raising his hand. So
the old-fashioned way. It
Yes.
works like this. You have to. There's a muscle, I think, somewhere on the shoulder.
And I think, Arnon, after you speak, we're going to open the floor. It's getting quite late or
sure.
early,
And we can
depending
move
on
to
when
the
you are.
less formal, I think. So I
Yes.
just want to follow up both on Isaac and T, both with respect to conspiracy theories and to vaccine hesitancy. It's interesting that these phenomena behave. There's very great difference between, for instance, the American scene and the Israeli scene. So it's very difficult, I think, to learn from our experience with studying fake news on the Hebrew Facebook. I don't think it tells us much about fake news on the English-speaking Facebook. So just for one example, in the United States currently, vaccine hesitancy, which I think most of us would think is associated with an epistemic phenomenon. There's no such, and in the United States, there's a clear political split on it. There's no such thing in Israel. And also, I'm not aware in Israel of anything like the QAnon phenomena. In fact, it's, which is, I mean, there are QAnon followers, certainly, in Israel. It's spreading worldwide.
Avishai Ben Chaim and the hegemony, that, you know, that's just parallel.
I think it's,
it's the theory that the deep state haunts Benjamin.
Yeah, no, but it doesn't
Netanyahu.
work through this kind of conspirational work that is being done by tens of millions, I don't know how many in the United States that are obsessed with the conspiracy theories right now through QAnon. I don't think there's anything similar in Israel, which is and certainly something that we need to explain why this phenomena is so dominant in one place and not as dominant in another.
Thank you, Arnon, and I see Karen wanted to speak, right?
Yeah, thanks. I kind of wanted to take a different tack on T's point about asymmetry. And one of the things that I think has been really missing over the workshop is more discussion about the problems of capitalism here, right? So a lot of this has to do with who has capital, who has access to the means of intellectual production and the ability to own social media platforms, and the ways in which, for example, we're thinking about US politics, right? The Republican Party is the party of billionaires, and our social media companies are afraid to piss off conservatives. And so I've been really concerned a little bit that some of the discussion that folks have sort of had implied trust in powerful organizations, which are not here to serve epistemic interests or the interests of the people, but are here either to preserve their political powers in the case of Nigeria, or their economic powers in the case of a lot of these social media companies. So I think part of what worries me is we have a lot of recommendations which, you know, on the one hand, as philosophers, it makes sense, like who doesn't like a good norm, right? But the idea that, you know, we want norms and then we're going to trust social media companies to instill them. Why should we have any trust in them to instill any kind of epistemic norms or norms that are actually beneficial to regular people? Similarly for regulation in government. So I think part of what I think is really missing here is like, not just like, I mean, I think some of the discussion of asymmetry, you know, in that book is really interesting. And, you know, I don't know what to make of the methodological critiques. I did see Dan Hicks' points about that. But we can't be neutral when it comes to issues of power. And one of my main concerns is that philosophers have way too much of a desire to be neutral on these issues and don't talk enough about how power relations are driving a lot of these problems. And some of our solutions are just going to be incredibly naive or fall into the hands of people who already have economic power and are not working in our interests. So, I mean, I think I would like to see a bit more discussion in these kinds of environments about how we can collectively organize in an incredibly, to use like T's term, like hostile epistemic environment, which is being driven for economic needs to maintain political and economic power for elites. And what are we supposed to do as individuals in that incredibly hostile environment where we don't own the means of production, right, or which all of our information is being shared. But nonetheless, social media is really interesting, right? It opens up democratizing spaces, but we don't own those spaces. So I really think it would be exciting to me to see philosophers engage more in interesting like political resistance strategies, to see epistemologists interested less in like coming up with norms that we then trust other people to inculcate, and actually talking about like, okay, how, if we're epistemologists and we care about knowledge, how are we going to start taking back some of the power that has been taken from people who actually care about truth? So I really would like, these issues of like neutrality, I would like to see epistemologists be less neutral about some of these questions of power. I think that's scary for philosophers to do, but I think some of these like issues of objectivity really come to the fore and are really impacting our ability to actually come up with solutions which are going to make any kind of difference whatsoever. So that's my rant on power.
Well, thank you again. This interesting perspective. I think we have some very loyal people who are still here with us, non-presenters. Do any of you want to jump in? Any of the black boxes that we see with no video? If not, then maybe we should go to the informal part. Oh, Boaz, you wanted to also throw in last words?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I will. Just I'm in an awkward position when I have to defend myself against the charges that I usually point to other people. So yeah, you're right, Karen. Maybe Maya and Isaac and thinking was a bit naive, because in the paper we do say that that content moderation is not a good solution, because we don't trust big media companies to moderate content for us. And we suggest implementing norms instead. And as you rightly say, why do you trust them to implement the right norms? And there's much truth to that. And also, as philosophers, Steve Fuller has this distinction, which I think he takes from Pareto, between the lions and the foxes. So the lions are the establishment. They want to preserve the rules, to keep those in power, and they are willing to cut corners and sort of like cover up all kinds of places where the establishment doesn't work as it's supposed to do. While the foxes are the ones that keep harassing the lions and expose their faults and so on. And my heart is with the foxes. I see myself as a fox. And I've had this conversation about this with Jacob Stegenga, which some of you may know. And like both of us raised a lot of concerns that now in the COVID era, suddenly it's because we want everybody to follow the norms and wear masks and get vaccines and so on, it becomes almost prohibited in some circles to actually question the wisdom behind those recommendations. Do the mask actually save us, from COVID? Regardless of the fact that, yeah, you should, but what is the actual efficacy? Can we ask that question at all? Can we talk about differentiating between different kinds of masks? Maybe not all cloth is the same. Are all vaccines safe and so on? And I wear a mask and I'm vaccinated and so on. But the fact that there is a kind of atmosphere when philosophers are not encouraged to ask those kinds of critical questions. Drug companies, since when are we trusting them? The companies that develop the vaccines are the same ones that develop the opiates treatment that claimed that they were safe and got millions of people hooked up on drugs. And then those studies passed all of the regulations. Suddenly we're just trusting them to produce the vaccines from us without asking any questions. These are tough questions to ask. And maybe even the answers that we get in the end are, no, that the vaccines are actually safe, which I think probably will be the case. We should ask, how do we know that? Are we, and how do you know that? And are we satisfied with the answers that they give us? And maybe, you talked about capitalism. Maybe they're not maybe they're making too much money out of these vaccines, or I don't know, because there's a lot of money going on. And yeah, I think it's very important to keep asking those questions. And I actually think that the left, or the progressive parts of politics today, are the ones that don't want people to ask those questions, because they align with some conservative and COVID denial tendencies. So yeah, I'm with the Foxes, even when it's uncomfortable. And I take your point, Karen, very seriously. We should ask always, follow the money. Who is benefiting from different solutions? Who should we trust? Regardless of the answers that we get, we should always ask those questions.
Thank you, Boaz. Chris, you asked a question in the chat. Would you like to present it? Maybe yourself?
Yeah, sure. It was fairly long. And here, I'll try to get my video on, even though I have all my Skype closed and my Skype look. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So yeah, I mean, a little bit of background. I'm a first-year writing teacher, so I teach digital literacy, and I also have background in working in writing centers as well, and training writing center consultants to work with freshmen through graduate students with their work. And I've become increasingly distracted and worried about the political situation in the United States, and have to wonder that my pedagogies directly engage students with Facebook, TikTok, and disinformation networks and individuals that disseminate it. I motivate them to become active participants in fighting disinformation in those networks. I don't think institutions are taking it very seriously, the responsibility physically that might mean for our students in modern America, especially in the context of January 6th, which is, I think, hopefully reoriented a lot of people's perspectives about the seriousness and how poorly we've measured how pervasive disinformation has become in our country. So I guess that wasn't really a summation, that was an extension of it all. But I wonder, are we doing enough as institutions? At the University of Central Florida, we have ballistic glass in our department now, as of a year and a half ago. It's kind of strange, but are we doing enough as institutions to help our students consider what they're becoming a part of if they're becoming agents who are combating disinformation in the public sphere? Because I think it might be increasingly dangerous. So I wonder, like, from an institutional perspective, do you think our institutions are in the United States at least are prepared to deal with the physical reality that January 6th demonstrated? If individuals or groups that gathered there are willing to identify networks that are combating the information that they're putting out, what does that mean for us? And I guess that's my question.
Okay. And anyone wants to?
I have something to say about that. In the appendix of my book, I've written some things about how to protect researchers who do research on some of these issues. And I'll put it in the chat. There's a really great resource for scholars on how to protect yourself from online harassment if you do risky research. And I think this might be a useful tool for your students, because one of the concerns I do have is that we're often asking undergrads, grad students, right? Institutions are expecting scholars to do work fighting disinformation and fighting hate speech, et cetera, but the protections for people are completely individualized. And so actually this thing has recommendations for administrators about policies that they should put in place to protect scholars who get harassed for the work that they do. And I think some of it might also apply to protecting students for the work that they do. So I do think it's a completely undiscussed topic in academia, where we're just sort of like throwing people out to the wolves and asking them to study these things, but you can easily become targeted. So I'll put the link in the chat. And I think it's a really great resource.
Fair admission to the group. I downloaded a bunch of Parler data because of a call to download a bunch of Parler data from an academic. And as I started doing that, I started thinking, I have a lot of Parler data now, and I'm probably not the only person who knows how to do that or knows how to track how data moved across those networks. And I'm okay with that, assuming that risk. That's part of my job, right? But that's, I appreciate your work, and I appreciate the resources, because like I think it's necessary to have individual students become parts of a network and parts of our culture that is refusing and actively fighting disinformation. But again, like I've just felt increasingly like I don't think all my students are willing to take the risks that maybe we are as teachers or whatever in our disciplines. So I think that figuring out methods for doing that actively is really, really important.
Okay, thank you.